Lauren Sullivan had worked at the Crimson Room for 8 months. She knew the rules, and she obeyed them absolutely. No touching the dancers, no exceptions. But when Richard Claymore, a wealthy Wall Street businessman, a longtime regular who seemed untouchable, broke the rules and snapped her arm in a private room, Lauren learned something else. The owner of the Crimson Room, an Italian man with the name Dominic Russo, had rules of his own, and when his rules were broken, consequences were inevitable. The Crimson Room sat deep in the heart of Midtown Manhattan, wedged between soaring glass towers and upscale fusion restaurants. From the outside, it looked like any other high-end lounge with elegant signage, a discreet entrance, and valets in crisp uniforms. Inside was another world entirely. Everything radiated a quiet opulence. Light from crystal chandeliers poured over crimson velvet chairs and glinted across dark wood floors, and a stage outfitted like a miniature theater. The space was designed to enchant, to make people forget time and money and even themselves. Lauren stepped into that world with a clear purpose: to survive and to be independent. 32 years old, she was pursuing a graduate program in psychology at NYU, spending her days buried in books and academic research, and by night becoming Scarlett, her stage name, a skilled dancer whose movements were confident and alluring, yet never crossed the line. She was never confused about her role. She did not seek salvation or love from customers. The Crimson Room was not a place for dreaming, but a piece of her life strategy to earn money, pay tuition, keep a small apartment in Queens, an inch away from the instability of her past. She knew her strengths well, a strong figure shaped by years of modern dance, dark brown hair falling to her back, gray blue eyes sharp and steady. But Lauren did not rely on appearance alone. She learned to observe and to sort customers by every look and gesture. Who lost control when drunk, who abused power, who was genuinely courteous and who only played the part. The Crimson Room was a grand stage, but Lauren knew she was not its only actor. What kept her there was not only the considerable income but the rules that were enforced with real seriousness. Dancers were respected and protected. Managers were understanding. Security responded quickly and effectively. And behind it all stood Dominic Russo, the man everyone in the club both admired and feared, though very few truly knew anything about him. Lauren had seen him a few times, usually at the beginning or end of a shift, when he moved quietly down the hallway and spoke briefly with the manager. Always courteous, always proper, never familiar with the dancers, not even those who had worked there a long time. To Lauren, he was the emblem of a silent power, the one who wrote the rules and kept the train on its tracks. She did not know much about him, only that he was somewhere in his 40s, tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes dark and deep as if they had witnessed too many things no one should see. Dominic did not smile at customers. He did not linger, and most importantly, he did not touch anyone. His presence alone kept order. And Lauren felt safe because of that, until that Friday night, when a rule was broken, when pain rushed in like a storm and nothing was the same. If you have listened this far and feel the story drawing you into the world of Lauren Sullivan and Dominic Russo, let us know by subscribing, by liking this video, and by sharing it with friends who love stories full of feeling and depth. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment with the name of your city or state so we know where Lauren's journey has reached your heart across America or even from anywhere else in the world. Your response gives us strength to bring more stories each day where love, renewal, and quiet kindness still live around us. She had never spoken directly with Dominic Russo. In 8 months at the Crimson Room, Lauren had only seen him from a distance, during his brief appearances in the hallway or the manager's office. Always on time, always quiet, and always somehow not quite present, even though everyone knew the club belonged to him. On the rare occasions he passed the dressing room or the backstage area, the air seemed to thicken. The dancers adjusted their outfits, and the security staff straightened their backs. No one ordered them to do it, but everyone understood. That man did not need to raise his voice to be heard. Lauren remembered the first time she saw Dominic. She was in the break room, sipping water between sets, when the door swung open. He entered with the floor manager to review the night's notes. Dominic was tall, easily over 1.80 meters, a solid frame set beneath a perfectly tailored dark suit. The lights caught on his neatly combed black hair, and on eyes so dark they were nearly black, a gaze cool and keen, not the casual coolness of indifference, but the chill of someone who had stood at the edge between survival and ending so many times that nothing could surprise him anymore. When that gaze brushed over her and the other dancers, it carried neither desire nor judgment, only observation, a swift assessment, and then it moved on. Good evening was the only thing he had ever said to her in all those months. His voice was low, slightly husky, each word distinct, unhurried, not intimate, polite, distant, and unreadable. Lauren knew little about the past of Dominic Russo, hearing only the whispers behind the curtains that he was the son of a Sicilian-born Italian boss who had once lived in Queens before building the Crimson Room. Some said he had worked in finance, others swore he had ties to the Mafia, that he was not only the owner of the club but also the one who controlled other hidden operations in the city. Lauren did not care, so long as he kept this place safe, and so long as his rules protected her from hands that were not allowed to touch. His past was not something she needed to know. What she respected in Dominic was not the power itself, but the way he used it. In a place where the line between respect and violation could be blurred by a few bills, he was the one who drew the boundary and defended it at any cost. A customer was escorted out of the club simply for yanking a dancer's arm too hard. A group of men were refused service because they had drunk too much and had turned crude. Those were not decisions of security, acting on impulse, but orders from the office upstairs. And everyone knew that office belonged to Dominic Russo. Lauren believed he did not notice her. Among dozens of dancers working here, she was not the most striking nor the longest tenured, but she was wrong. That night, when Richard Claymore seized her arm, and the bone in her upper limb snapped with a dry crack, and she screamed through a pain that tore like fabric, Dominic Russo was no longer a shadow behind a pane of glass. She did not know how he arrived so fast. She only remembered being guided into the office in a half-conscious haze, with tears flooding her face while she clung to the last small shard of composure. And then the door opened, and Dominic stepped in. He looked at her for no more than a second, and his gaze traveled from her broken arm to the pallor of her pain-stricken face. There was no soothing word, and no polite question asking if she was all right. Only a single sentence, low and cold, like a blade cutting the air. "Who broke your arm?" It was not a courtesy question and not the surface concern of small talk. It was a question carrying a decision, and a question that demanded a careful answer, because the consequence would not be a simple call for security to walk a patron out. "Richard Claymore," she whispered. "Room number 4. He yanked me back. I said no." His eyes did not change color, yet Lauren felt the silence bend the air around them. He turned to the man, standing by the door, and said, "Hold him. Do not let him leave." And for the first time in her life, Lauren saw with absolute clarity that Dominic Russo was not merely an owner. He was a man of laws, and when someone broke those laws, he did not forgive, not ever. That evening had begun like any other weekend night at the Crimson Room. Patrons arrived early, most of them businessmen in expensive suits with a few bachelor parties and a few names from the finance world who stopped in for a drink and then slipped back into the dark. Lauren clocked in at 8 o'clock, changed, did her makeup, loosened her muscles with a set of familiar stretches. She was always careful with her body, because it was her livelihood and her instrument, and the last boundary between herself and the hungry eyes that prowled at the edges. Her first set began at 10. She wore a black and red costume that was tasteful and alluring in equal measure. The music was a light electronic jazz and the sweep of the stage. Lights moved over her long hair until she seemed to glimmer. She did not lock onto any single gaze. She moved with the measure of rhythm and breath and the steady beat inside her chest. 3 main numbers on the main stage, 2 private dances in monitored rooms, then a break at midnight. Around 12:30, the floor manager came to her just as she slipped back into the dressing room. "Room number 4, Richard Claymore. He prepaid for half an hour." Lauren nodded without surprise. Richard was a regular, who had requested her many times, always polite, always generous with tips, always stopping at the line. At times she had thought he might be one of the few who kept himself under control, but that night was not as usual. She checked her lipstick, smoothed a hand through her hair, and walked toward the private rooms. Room number 4 was at the end of the corridor, and had the gleam of a 5-star hotel lounge with deep velvet chairs and softened lighting, and a surveillance camera set in the corner. The rules were explicit. The room was watched continuously, and any act that crossed the boundary would be handled at once. Richard was already seated when she entered, his suit a bit rumpled with his tie loosened and a glaze of feverish excitement in his eyes. Scarlet, "You are beautiful tonight," he said with a smile that was not quite the one she knew. "Thank you, Mr. Claymore," she answered with formality, and stepped onto the small performance area in the corner. The music rose, a slow rhythm and blues that let her body flow in soft arcs. The first 5 minutes passed without incident. Then she saw his eyes go murky while his head tilted back, and his mouth stretched in a laugh too wide. He had drunk too much. 10 minutes in, he leaned forward. "Come closer, Scarlett." "You know the rules, Mr. Claymore. No touching. I have paid for a private room. I want you nearer." Lauren kept the distance and kept moving without stepping in. "This is as close as it gets, Mr. Claymore." At 15 minutes, Richard suddenly stood. "I said, come here." His voice had shed its softness, something rough and ungoverned taking its place. Lauren stepped back toward the door and said that she would call security if he did not sit down. He asked if she knew how much money he had spent here, and said he was not asking for anything outrageous and that she owed him this. She said no, and that she owed him nothing. Her hand found the door handle, but he was too fast. Richard seized her wrist and squeezed. She told him to let go. He said she had provoked him for months by dancing and smiling and taking his money, and that now he wanted something back. She told him he had paid for a dance, not for this, and to let go. She struggled, trying to wrench free from the clamp of his hand, and then he yanked hard. The crack sounded like a branch splitting in a frozen forest. Lauren did not even have time to scream before pain arrived, fast and violent like an explosion. All the dim light in the room seemed to rush into a single point, her left arm bent at an unnatural angle. She screamed. The door flew open. Security rushed in and tore Richard away, while he kept shouting about lawyers and his connection to the mayor and other things that no longer meant anything. Lauren collapsed to the floor with her hand braced over the hurt and her heart thundering out of rhythm. A voice rose behind her and said to call Dominic. She did not remember who said it. She only knew that in that instant the world was spinning, and a primal fear was rising. Though not fear of Richard, it was fear of what would happen next when the man who made the rules walked in and saw those rules torn apart. The pain blurred her sight, but she still heard footsteps in the corridor, measured and heavy and sure. The door opened. Dominic Russo entered with a face without expression, and eyes gone dark that passed over her, and then fixed on the two guards holding a thrashing Richard Claymore. He asked if it was him, his voice, low and even and not angry, yet it made the room turn to ice. Lauren nodded with effort and said the private room, that he pulled her and that she said no, and then he did it. She could not finish because the pain closed her throat. Dominic turned away without taking his eyes off Richard and said to take him down to the holding room and to tie him, and that no one was to speak to him, except for Dominic. There was a curt nod, and then Richard disappeared from her sight beneath a stream of useless protests. Dominic turned back and sat beside her and asked if she could stand. She tried to nod and said she thought so. He did not ask anything further. He rose and gave an order to someone outside to ready a car and to call Dr. Russo and to have him come immediately and privately. Then he came back and held out his hand and told her to come with him. Lauren leaned into him, not knowing which floor they were going to, only feeling his hand steady at her elbow, guiding her along a narrow hall, until a door of dark wood opened. The room beyond was another world, not the space of a nightclub but a private apartment, wide and quiet and bathed in warm golden light, with classical Italian furnishings, leather chairs, shelves of books, and black and white photographs on the walls. The faint scent of coffee and old wood drifted through as Dominic helped her to a long sofa near the window. He vanished for a few seconds and returned with a cold cloth and a bag of ice wrapped in a towel, and told her to lay it gently over the break. She did as he said, shaking. He stood and poured a glass of pale brown liquor and asked if she did not like alcohol. Lauren shook her head and said she did not drink. He told her that for now she should. She took the glass and sipped. It stung and burned and then warmed her chest. Dominic sat across from her and watched, not cold but not softened either. He drew out his phone and spoke quickly in Italian. She caught fragments, broken bone and discreet and urgent, and then he ended the call. He said the doctor would arrive in 10 minutes and not to a hospital, and that there would be no questions, and that he would cover the cost. Lauren frowned and said she could not and that she had student insurance, but it would not be enough for something like this. Dominic leaned toward her and his voice dropped, and he said that this happened in his club under his watch, and that she did not need to thank him, but she should not refuse. She did not know how to answer. In her head the sound of the bone breaking still echoed, and Richard's shouting still rang. and now there was only this strange quiet inside a warm apartment, where the most intimidating man in the club sat less than an arm's length away, pouring liquor and calling a doctor. She said that Richard Claymore claimed to know many people, police and lawyers, and even the mayor. Dominic looked at her, his tone steady, and said that he knew and that Richard also knew who Dominic was and that Richard would not dare to make a sound. It did not land as a threat. It felt like a law in his world. When someone did wrong, there would be consequences. Lauren did not ask what he planned to do. Something in his eyes told her she did not need to know. She sat there with her hand still cupping the broken place and tried to hold herself together. Dominic stood and took a blanket from a cabinet and set it over her shoulders. He said she could stay the night, and that he would not let her go home alone with an arm like that, and that there would be a room reserved for her, clean and private. She thanked him, her voice raw, and said she had not expected him to be like this. He paused before turning away and said that he had his laws and that Richard had broken them. She said nothing more. The apartment settled into a hush with only the tick of a clock on the wall. For the first time in her life, she saw that Dominic Russo was no longer the figure of power passing through a hallway. He was real, very real, and he had kept her from falling apart on the coldest night she had ever known. Lauren sat still on the chair, wrapped in a blanket, her hand holding the ice pack steady against the aching arm. She heard Dominic speaking to someone near the door in that same low Italian threaded with certainty, the cadence brief but never harsh. A moment later, the door opened again, and an older man with salt and pepper hair stepped in, carrying a classic black leather medical bag. Dominic introduced him simply as Dr. Russo, a distant relative, and then stepped back to make room. Lauren felt the doctor's touch was light, and his eyes kind yet unwavering. He examined the break, asked a few questions, and said in English with a faint Italian weight that the humerus was a spiral fracture, but not the worst kind, and that he could set it here, although it would hurt a great deal, and asked whether she wished to wait until morning for the hospital or do it now. She looked at Dominic, who did not. Her only watched in silence, and Lauren bit her lip and said, "To do it here now." Dominic did not look away from her yet. When the doctor asked for help stabilizing, he sat beside her and put one arm around her shoulders and took her good hand in his other and told her it would be quick in a voice soft and sure. The pain when the doctor set the bone made Lauren cry out, and the world smeared with tears and the rasp of clenched teeth. But Dominic held her fast, and his hand did not tremble, and his voice was a steady murmur, telling her to breathe, and that it was almost over and to hold on. When the bone settled back in place, her body went slack like a drenched cloth. The doctor wrapped a temporary dressing and instructed her on medication and rest, and told her to come to the clinic in the morning to have a cast put on. Dominic handed her a pill, then pressed a glass of water into her grasp, and she was too tired to protest, and only nodded and swallowed. Afterward he helped her to her feet, and led her into a small bedroom set in the corner of the apartment where the bed was made, and the lamp cast a warm pool of light, and he said there were clean clothes in the closet, and that he would leave the door ajar if she needed anything. Lauren did not remember when she fell asleep. Only that dawn light through the curtains woke her, and the arm still throbbed but less than before, and she realized she was wearing a roomy gray men's t-shirt that must be Dominic's with a clean, calm scent in the fabric. She stepped out unsteady with hunger and medicine, and found Dominic at the kitchen counter making coffee. He turned when he saw her and pointed to a chair and told her to sit and said, "Black coffee, no sugar." That he remembered she took it that way, and she was surprised and asked if he paid that much attention. And Dominic did not answer, only poured her a cup and set it down and took the seat across from her. After a pause he said that the man would not bother her again, and that he had spoken to him that morning. She did not ask what spoken meant, only met Dominic's eyes and nodded and said thank you, and he shook his head and told her she thanked people too often, and that this was simply what should be done. She looked at him, and daylight softened his features, revealing a few lines at the eyes, and a thin scar on the left cheek she had not seen the night before, and he looked tired, but clear-eyed still. The Dominic Russo, the whole club respected, and feared, and also the man who had held her through the night, when she cried out in pain. She said she had not believed she would feel safe after what happened, and that he had, and he cut in to say she had been hurt in a place he ran, and that this was his fault. And she gave a small bitter smile and shook her head and told him he was not the one who pulled her arm, and he said he was the one who made the rules, and that if those rules were broken and he did not respond, they would mean nothing. She fell quiet because his words were not merely responsibility, but a way of living, and she recognized it. And perhaps in a world thick with shadows, a person with a code was rare. Dominic stood and set a set of car keys on the table and said 10 o'clock, and that he would take her to the clinic for the cast, and that afterward, if she wanted to go home, he would send a car, and if not, she could stay here a few days until Telbes. She was stronger. Lauren looked up and asked whether he would let her stay, and Dominic met her eyes and said he would not let her go home alone with a cast in the first winter chill, and that he never left his people by themselves after they had been hurt. For the first time, something warm threaded through the ache in her chest. Not a blaze and not desire, but a quiet connection, deep and steady, as if something had reached the most fragile place inside her, and laid a hand there, gentle and firm. Lauren said yes, that she would go get the cast and that she would stay a little while, and Dominic nodded without a plaid word, though. His gaze softened as if something had been forged between them that neither had yet named. The appointment at Dr. Russo's clinic unfolded quickly and precisely, just as Dominic had promised, and Lauren received a professional cast of light, white fiberglass with instructions for basic care and a new prescription for pain and a reporter. Follow up in 6 weeks, and Dominic stayed beside her the whole time, speaking little yet present for every necessary moment, from helping her with her shirt and opening the car door, to speaking with the doctor on her behalf when she was too exhausted to focus. When they were done, instead of driving her back to the small apartment in Queens as she expected, Dominic turned the car toward Midtown and returned to the Crimson Room, and she tilted her head to look at him, a mix of curiosity and doubt. He did not glance over and kept his eyes on the road, and said he needed her in the office, because there was something to discuss. The words carried no command, yet they were not an invitation either, but felt like a decision already made, and he was letting her in on it. The office sat on the top floor directly above the main stage, and Lauren had never been inside and found a broad room with dark wood floors and a large window over the city where natural light warmed the space with a calm glow, and Dominic drew out a chair for her and then went to the desk and brought a stack of papers and set them on the table between them, and said her arm would need at least 6 weeks to heal, and perhaps longer if therapy ran long. And Lauren nodded wary, and said she knew, and that she would find temporary work of some kind, and could make calls or enter data or anything at all. Dominic folded his arms and regarded her as if weighing something he had considered for a long time before speaking, and said she had worked here 8 months, and that he had reviewed her file, and that she had never been late, and had no complaints, and was often requested by clients and respected by staff, and that on the night in question she had kept her composure when others might have panicked. Lauren frowned, a little unused to such direct assessment, and said she had only done her job, and Dominic shook his head and said she had done more, and he pushed the papers toward her and said he wanted her to take an administrative role at the club on a temporary basis or longer if she wished, managing dancer schedules, arranging shifts, tracking their requests, and resolving small internal conflicts. Lauren stared and said she was not sure she was capable and that she had never managed before, and Dominic answered gently but firmly that she was earning a master's degree in psychology and understood how people respond, and that she knew how to observe and to listen, and that most important, he trusted her. Those last 2 words made her pause, because in all her years of work across different places, almost no one had said that to her, and certainly not a man like Dominic Russo. She looked down at the papers, still startled, and asked if he truly wanted her to do this job here, with a cast on her arm, and Dominic gave a small shrug and said she did not need 2 hands to organize schedules or write emails, and that he would have someone provide technical support at the start if needed, but that this was a real job, with a contract and real pay, and no high heels and no stage lights. She was quiet for a long moment while questions and worries flickered through her, and then an odd lightness slid in, not because of money, but because someone had seen her value beyond appearance and body and dance. She said yes slowly, that she would try, and Dominic nodded as if it was the answer he had been waiting for, and told her she would start the next day at 10 in the morning, and that the office door would always be open. When she rose to leave, he called her name softly, and she turned, and he did not step closer, but met her with a gaze deep and steady as stone, and said thank you for not falling, and she smiled and said, thank you for giving me a reason to stand. In the slant of afternoon light through the glass there were no more words, yet something stood clear as day between them, that this was not only a job but the beginning of something entirely new. Lauren began the new work the next morning, and at exactly 10 she arrived at the top-floor office of the Crimson Room, not in the familiar suggestive costume of a dancer, but in simple jeans and a buttoned shirt with her hair tied back. The cast made her clumsy in every movement, yet she would not let it slow her. And Dominic was not in the office when she arrived, and an employee named Carla was waiting to guide her through the basics: the shift software, the schedule, the request tracker, and internal reports between management and the dancers. And at first it all seemed overwhelming, since Lauren had never held a professional office role or handled dry matters like hours, procedures, and conflicts between shifts, but within a few days she began to realize she was better than she had imagined, and she took careful notes and listened closely and learned quickly how each dancer operated, who was easy to work with, who complained often, who was often late yet brought in significant revenue, and she did not manage with force but with understanding, and it changed things. The dancers were cautious at first, unsure whether she was Dominic's spy or merely someone pushed into an office because she had been hurt. Yet one by one they began to knock on the door to talk and to ask for schedule changes or time off, or to propose adjustments. And Lauren did not make grand promises, but she listened, and when she was able to alter a few small things, they began to trust. After 2 weeks, the backstage air at the Crimson Room felt easier, with fewer complaints, and less tension and petty conflicts were resolved before they flared, and the schedule ran more smoothly. And Lauren even made a bold proposal that once a month the dancers could rotate roles on the performance night to keep the work from growing stale. And Dominic agreed after 5 minutes reading her proposal, and he did not praise or comment, only signed the approval. Yet Lauren saw in the way he looked at her in that moment that he was watching her work in his own way. They did not speak as often as she had imagined, because Dominic was usually occupied with other matters: private meetings, conversations with lawyers, financial management, or sometimes he vanished for hours and no one asked because no one dared. And yet when he was in the office the air changed, not tense but certain. And each time he passed her desk, their eyes met for half a second, enough for Lauren to know he still paid attention and had never withdrawn the decision to place her here. On a weekend night near closing time, Lauren was still at her desk, reviewing the schedule for the next week, when Dominic passed by and stopped behind her and said she was doing better than the 3 people he had hired before, and his voice was even and low. And she turned surprised and asked if that was true. And he said it was, and he did not smile yet. His eyes gentled, and she asked why, and said honestly that she had no experience and had been trained here only a few weeks. And why did he trust her? And Dominic thought for a moment and said it was because she had once stood under stage lights and knew what it felt like to smile while every part of her wanted to run, and because she did not try to control people, and instead she guided them. Lauren looked at him, and a feeling without a name rose in her being, to be seen and to be recognized, not for appearance but for the way she moved through the world, and she said thank you, not out of politeness but from the center of herself. And Dominic only nodded and turned away. Yet Lauren knew there was another thread between them now, not because she was someone who needed help, but because she was becoming a real part of the world he was building, and for the first time in many years, she began to think that perhaps she could belong here in a completely different way. Lauren found herself noticing the small things she used to overlook, and Dominic did not change his manner with her in any obvious way, yet every detail, every action seemed to take on a different color, and he never spoke sweetly and never touched her more than was necessary, but he was always present at the right moment, in the right way. And on mornings when the cold arrived without warning, her coffee was already made, the way she liked it, and set on her desk before she arrived, and no one else in the office knew she drank it black without sugar. And on a day when Lauren could not hide the fatigue after a late night of work, Dominic did not ask or console. He simply set a box of sandwiches from her favorite shop in Queens on the desk and walked away, and she said nothing but ate every bite, even though the cast still made her hand clumsy. And little by little his quiet care became part of her days, like a slow rhythm that never asked to be seen. Lauren noticed herself changing too, and she waited for Dominic to appear each afternoon, at first because of work, because she needed to confirm plans and schedules, and then she realized she was watching him more than she needed to. The way he stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, and his gaze resting on the city, and the way he spoke to staff, curt but never disrespectful, and the way he remembered each person's name, and the small details that no one else bothered to hold. And Dominic was not easy to approach. Yet he made people feel they could trust him once he let himself step into their world. The closer she drew, the more Lauren sensed a part of him was always locked, a past he had never shared, a portion of himself that never rose to the surface, and that very thing made her curious. And then the curiosity softened into fondness, feeling as light as breath but impossible to deny. Once, while they were reviewing the monthly income and expense report, Lauren dropped a folder, and her right hand was still weak, so even the simple act of bending felt awkward, and Dominic stepped in without a word, and gathered each sheet, and arranged them in order, and when he handed them back, his eyes lingered on her hand a moment longer than usual, without pity and without prying, only a silent look that carried the question. He did not speak, and she smiled and said that she was doing physical therapy at home, twice a day, and that she would regain her strength soon. And Dominic nodded and said good, and that if she needed anything, she should say so. And it was an ordinary sentence, but from him it carried a different weight, not the show of gallantry, but a kind of certainty, the sense that if she needed him, he would be there. Another night, Lauren stayed late, and as she finished the shift ledger, the corridor lights flickered and cut out, and in that sudden dark she startled and almost fell, and Dominic stepped out of his office with a flashlight and asked if she was all right. His tone steady while his eyes swept her from head to toe, and she said it only startled her and tried to keep her voice even. And he came closer and adjusted the shawl on her shoulders, and his hand touched her for half a second, and the warmth followed her through the night. What grew between them did not flare and did not rush. It was like a small flame, kept even by patience and respect, and neither of them named it, and neither of them forced it. Yet the glances that lasted a few seconds longer, and the silences that were easy, and the appearances that came exactly when needed, began to draw an invisible line both of them could feel. And Lauren knew that if one day he stepped closer, she would not retreat, because even without a single spoken vow, Dominic had shown her something more certain than words. The choice to stay, not from duty and not from obligation, but because he truly wanted to be with her. Lauren could not say what shifted the air between them that evening, only that nothing followed a script, and yet everything felt as if it were meant to be. And she had just finished checking the schedule for the new week, and the office clock stood at nearly 11 o'clock at night, and the club below had thinned to quiet, and the background music softened, and the corridor lights dimmed on their timer, and Dominic entered without knocking as he always did, and set his car keys and phone on the desk and poured himself a whiskey. And Lauren was gathering the files when he spoke without looking at her in a voice low and very quiet, and said that he had lost control once, and had promised himself it would never happen again, and she stilled and set the papers down and turned toward him. And Dominic looked into the glass and turned it with his fingers as if the ice were stirring old memories. And he said that when he was 25 he lost his father not to illness but to murder, a revenge carried out by a man his father had trusted, and that he was an only son and the sole heir, and that he was not allowed to be weak or to cry, and that he had to take over at once. And Lauren sat and kept her eyes on him, and Dominic went on in an even tone with a gaze weighted by what it carried, and said that he had done things he did not wish to recall, and that some called him ruthless, and that perhaps they were right, and that he had never laid a hand on a woman, and had never crossed that boundary, and that she was the first person who made him want to step beyond the safety of his limits. And he lifted his eyes and met hers and said he knew he was not simple and not a safe choice, and that he would not pretend to be someone else, and that he did not know how to love lightly, and did not know the right rituals of dating, and that he only knew that when he chose he would protect the person he chose, by any means, even the ones that were not pretty. Lauren swallowed, and her heart beat faster, not from fear but from the stark honesty of those words and the courage of a strong man opening the darkest part of himself. And she rose and moved to him, and said she did not need perfection, and that she was not perfect either, and that she had a past of her own, and that her childhood had not been kind, and that her mother worked 3 jobs at once, and her father left when she was 6, and that she grew up knowing she had to manage on her own, and that everything she had was something she had wrestled into being, and that she did not fear what was real. And Dominic tilted his head as if deciding whether to trust what he had just heard, and Lauren lifted her hand even with the cast, and touched lightly the hand he had, resting on the desk, and said she did not know exactly what was happening between them, but she knew she did not want to stop. And the silence pulled tight, and then Dominic rose, until only a breath of space stood between them, and his eyes no longer searched, and instead gentled and deepened, and he asked if she was sure almost in a whisper, and Lauren nodded without hesitation, and he kissed her, and the kiss was not hurried and carried no reckless desire. It was a statement and a turning, and something that had been held too long, finally let loose, and his mouth was steady and warm and sure, and his arm came around her waist not to bind, but simply to keep her if she chose to pull away, and she did not pull away, and she answered his kiss, without doubt and without fear. When they drew apart, both were breathing a little hard, not from tension but because their hearts had fallen into the same rhythm, and Dominic looked at her as if seeing her truly for the first time, and she whispered that he did not need to be a perfect man, and only needed to be the man who did not leave, and he touched her cheek lightly, and a rare smile passed over him, brief but enough for Lauren to know he understood, and for the first time they were no longer manager, employee, no longer the wounded and the protector. They were simply two people carrying their own scars, and still choosing to step toward each other with no one promising anything for tomorrow, and yet in that moment they had truly begun. That morning started like any other, with soft sunlight slipping through the glass of the small office, where Lauren was arranging the weekly schedules for the dancers, and Dominic had left early for a meeting with a supplier, and he had left a hot coffee beside her computer, and everything seemed steady, until her phone began to buzz again and again with messages from dancers, security, and the floor manager, and Lauren opened the first one, and her eyes moved over the words, asking if she had seen the news that Richard Claymore had been arrested, and that it was big, and a cold line ran down her spine, and she opened her laptop and went to a local news site, and the headline shouted at the top of the page that Richard Claymore, chief executive officer of the financial firm Claymore Capital, had been arrested for assault against women, violent conduct, financial fraud, with a photo of Richard being led away by police, his face drained of color, and his silver hair in disarray, and the smugness gone to make room for fear. Lauren went still, not because she was surprised by his true nature, since she had lived it herself in private room number 4 on that fateful night, but because the truth had been dragged into daylight too suddenly, too violently, like a wave that smashed the last barriers inside her, and they had investigated, and they had found other victims, and one article laid out testimony from many women who had been abused by Richard in private spaces, most of them employees under his power or escorts brought to closed-door parties, and she was not the first and might not have been the last if he had not been stopped. Lauren sat blank in her chair while her head spun, and old memories surged back, the clamp of his grip, the press of his hand against her skin, the dry crack of bone, and the terror of knowing she was alone with a man who believed money could buy anything, even silence, and she clenched her good hand into a fist, but no matter how she tried, her heart still trembled. The office door opened, and Dominic came in with his phone still in his hand, and he looked at her for a single beat, and then crossed the room quickly and said that she had seen it, and she nodded, unable to speak, and Dominic sat beside her, and set a hand lightly on her shoulder and said he knew this would come soon and that he was not sure she was ready to face it, and she said she did not know what she felt, that part of her felt relief, and part of her felt anger, and that, most of all, she felt sorrow because he had done this to so many, and no one had dared to speak, and that she had stayed silent, and Dominic's hand tightened, and his eyes held their familiar calm, and he told her she had not been silent, that she had survived, and had stood up, and had come to work every day through pain and fear, and that this was how she spoke louder than any words, and she looked up with eyes shining and asked if he had a hand in this, and Dominic did not look away and said yes in part, and that he knew the person leading the economic case against Richard, and had sent along some information from the times Richard used a VIP card at the Crimson Room and from financial documents Richard had carelessly exposed, and that he had not controlled what happened, and that Richard had walked into the net on his own. Lauren was quiet for a long moment, then rose and went to the window and looked down at the restless New York street, and said she did not know whether to be grateful or angry, and Dominic stood behind her close enough to be felt and far enough not to press, and said she could feel both, and that there was no right or wrong here, only the truth. And the truth was that he had been arrested, and that men like him would not have the chance to harm anyone else. Lauren turned to him and thanked him not only for this but for always being there even when she did not say the words. And Dominic looked at her, and for the first time something in his gaze softened and grew tender, and he said he would always be there, whether she spoke or not. And for the first time since the harm had been done, Lauren let herself believe that the past no longer held power over her, and that she would choose how to move forward. That night Lauren could not sleep even after a hot shower and herbal tea and lying quiet inside Dominic's arms, and the city burned its lights beyond the window, and New York never truly slept, while Lauren felt herself falling into a dark pocket without an exit. And the articles, the images of Richard in handcuffs, the words of other victims, all spun on a loop like a broken tape, and she turned over and gave him her back, trying to hide the chaos behind a mask of silence. And he knew without questions and only needed to hear the uneven breath and feel the way her fingers clenched the sheet to understand. Dominic did not ask right away, and he waited to give her time to face herself. And when she finally spoke, her voice was small, as wind along a window, yet sharp enough to cut. And she asked whether if she had spoken sooner someone else might have been spared, and whether if she had been stronger, and had gone to the police that night, there would not be other women. And Dominic did not sit up. He only moved closer and wrapped an arm around her waist and drew her against his chest, and his breath was warm by her ear and his tone low and steady, and he told her not to blame herself, and that she had done everything she could in that moment, and that she had survived and stood up, and that this was a strength not everyone possessed. And Lauren shook her head, and she felt the tears begin and could not stop them, and said she still felt like a coward, and that she had stayed silent, and had let him go on living as if nothing had happened, and that all this time she had believed she had moved past it yet. Today, at the sight of his face, she understood she was still afraid, so afraid that her whole body had turned to stone. Dominic turned her to face him and wiped the tears with his thumb, and he did not tell her not to cry, and did not say everything would be fine, and told her only the truth, in a warm, weighted voice, that fear does not vanish and only changes shape, and that she was facing it and looking straight at it, and that this was not cowardice but courage. And she looked at him through reddened eyes, and asked why he never forced her to speak everything aloud, and why he did not interrogate or demand details. And Dominic tilted his head with his gaze fixed on her, and said it was because pain does not need explanation, and because some things can only be shared when a person is ready, and that he did not want her to speak out of obligation but wanted her to speak when she wished to be heard. His answer caught in her throat, and she had known too many who faked concern and offered empty comforts, and Dominic was different because he did not try to fix her and simply stayed and held ground without conditions. They lay quiet for a long while, with only the distant hum of traffic and the pulse of a streetlight flicker on the ceiling, and then Lauren whispered that she hated feeling weak, and that she had lived her whole life to prove she needed no one, and that now one look or a single sentence from him made her want to lean, and she was afraid of that. And Dominic gave a small laugh, not from mockery but understanding, and said that everyone needs someone no matter how strong, and that she was not weak, and that she was the strongest woman he had ever met, and that strength did not mean isolation, and that leaning on another did not make her less, but made her more true. And she nodded and whispered almost too soft to hear that she thanked him for being there, and Dominic drew her closer and pressed a protective kiss to her forehead and told her he would always be there, whether she was weak or strong, whether she laughed or cried, whether she was silent or shouting, and that he was not going anywhere. Lauren closed her eyes with tears still falling, yet this time from relief, because she knew that in the flicker of that darkness there was someone who would not leave, and perhaps that was the first step toward real healing. That weekend, while Lauren was folding laundry in her small apartment in Queens, Dominic leaned in the doorway with a hot coffee in his hand, and watched her with the steady concentration of a man weighing a contract larger than any deal he had ever signed, and she looked up and frowned lightly and said he was watching her like she was about to do something very dangerous. Dominic did not smile, yet his eyes softened as if what she was doing truly mattered, and he said that she was indeed about to do something dangerous, and that she was about to move in with a man people whispered was frightening. Lauren laughed lightly and honestly, and said that the man seemed to be holding her coffee, and Dominic stepped in and handed her the cup and said he wanted to ask one more time, not because he doubted her, but because he wanted to be certain, and asked if she truly wished to move in with him, and not out of gratitude or because of what had happened between them, but because she wanted it. Lauren set the coffee on the table and came to stand before him and said that she had lived alone long enough to know what safety felt like, and that she had never felt as at ease as she felt beside him, and that it was not because he was strong, but because he always gave her the right to choose, and that moving in together was not something she did for someone else, and that she did it because she wanted a place to call home, and she wanted that place to have him in it. He said nothing and simply drew her into his arms and held her for a long time, as if he were carving her words into his heart. The move itself took less than one afternoon, and Lauren did not own much, with a few boxes of books, clothes, a handful of small decorations, and a cactus that had miraculously survived 3 moves, and Dominic had a room cleared in the penthouse above the Crimson Room and turned it into a private office for Lauren, right next to the primary bedroom, and the kitchen was lightly upgraded according to her very serious requests, with a spice rack, a new blender, and a refrigerator that made her exclaim each time she opened it, asking if he planned to feed an entire team, and Dominic only lifted a shoulder and I said he had not known she snacked so much, and Lauren finished unpacking at dusk and dropped onto the sofa with a long breath, looking around at the apartment that was now a place she would call home, unlike the ones before that were temporary and cold, and always made her feel like a passing guest, and here there was her own breath, and Dominic's shadow, and the blend of 2 people who had thought they were used to loneliness. That night after a dinner, Dominic cooked himself a pasta he had learned from his mother. They sat together on the balcony with glasses of red wine, and the city's lights flaring in the distance and reflecting in the glass, and Lauren rested her head on his shoulder and sighed, not from fatigue, but because for the first time in her life, she felt she did not have to stay on guard, and she said that she thought they had just crossed a new line, and Dominic tilted his head and kissed her forehead and asked no way back, and she gave a small laugh and said, "No wish to go back." He tightened his arm and said he had once believed he was not suited to the idea of living together, that it felt like too much responsibility and too easy a path to hurt, and that with her everything felt natural, and Lauren looked at him with eyes that held the soft glow from the living room and said it was because they did not bind each other and that they simply stayed by each other, and Dominic nodded and said there would be no promises and no pressure, and that he wanted for her to know that if one day it all felt too close, and if she needed space, the door would always be open, and that he would not keep her by constraint. And Lauren squeezed his hand and said she did not need an open door, and that she needed a place to choose to return to, and that she chose this place and chose him. That night they lay together and words were not necessary, and the clock ticked, and the cars below murmured, and the steady beat of 2 once lonely hearts fell into a shared cadence, and Lauren knew that moving in was not a small turn but a quiet acknowledgement that she trusted him not only with her mind but with her heart. And Dominic, a man who had believed control was the only way to protect, had learned to let someone step into his life without fear of losing himself, and the boundary had been redrawn, and this time they drew it together. 1 week after Lauren moved in, Dominic came into the office where she was reading with focus, and he carried an ivory envelope, marked by a graceful slanting hand, and he set it on the desk, and his eyes held a hint of hesitation she rarely saw, and he said that his mother had invited her to dinner that Sunday, and Lauren looked up and paused and asked if it was that full family Sunday dinner he had mentioned, and Dominic nodded, with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders a touch tight, and said it might be a little loud, and that his mother cooked more than people could eat in 3 days, and that the aunts asked many questions, and the cousins were curious, and that Rosa Russo, his mother, resembled no one. Lauren sat still for a moment with her eyes on the envelope, and asked if he worried she would not be able to handle it, and Dominic gave a small shrug and said he worried his mother would interview her, as if hiring a presidential secretary. And Lauren smiled and set her book down and said that made it all the more important that she go, and that if she lived with him without meeting his mother it would feel incomplete. Sunday came and Dominic drove her to Queens to a 2-story brick house with a trellis of grapevines at the windows, and the scent of tomato sauce drifting all the way to the curb, and Lauren stepped into a wide kitchen where Rosa, a small woman with fierce presence, was stirring a pot so large. Lauren felt she had stepped into an old Italian restaurant scene, and Rosa turned, and her dark eyes flashed an immediate and thorough assessment the moment she saw Lauren, and she asked if she was Lauren, and Lauren answered yes, and that she was pleased to meet her, and Rosa told her to call her Rosa, and pointed to the kitchen table, and told her to tie on an apron, because they were rolling meatballs, and Dominic stood behind Lauren with his lips pressed as if he were holding back a laugh, and Lauren cut him a glance, then folded up her sleeves, and took the red and white striped apron, and Rosa said little, but her hands flew, and each time Lauren did something wrong, a single furrow of the brow was enough to show. what to fix, and between the exacting instructions came questions that were gentle and sharp. What she studied at NYU, where her family lived, whether she knew how to cook anything beyond pasta, whether she had driven Dominic to distraction yet, and Lauren answered each one without avoidance or detour. And when Rosa nodded for the first time after tasting a meatball, Lauren had rolled. She knew she had cleared the first gate. Dinner felt like a ceremony, and Dominic's whole family, with his mother, 2 sisters, 4 cousins, and a few uncles, gathered around a long table, and there was lasagna layered by Rosa's own hands, and roasted chicken with garlic and lemon, crusty bread for dipping into pesto, and the red wine never stopped flowing, and Dominic sat beside her with his hand resting lightly on her thigh beneath the table, a quiet protection and encouragement, and the conversation swept from work to Italian television to the new neighbors on Aunt Carmela's street, and yet eyes returned to Lauren now and then, as if weighing whether she truly belonged. When everyone was full, Rosa rose and poured more wine, and spoke clearly into the warm air of the meal, and said that Dominic had never brought anyone to Sunday dinner, not once, because he was stubborn and chose people the way he chose. Vintage wine, and that tonight he had brought Lauren, and that the girl rolled a decent meatball, and answered plainly, and knew when to argue back, which sent the whole table into laughter, and Rosa went on to say that from now on, if anyone asked whether Dominic was serious about someone, they should remember the name Lauren Sullivan. And Dominic dipped his head and said nothing, but pressed Lauren's hand under the table, and she turned to him and found the half-solemn, half-proud the look of a man who had once believed family was a burden, now sitting among those he loved and sharing the most precious thing in his life. Dominic drove for a while in silence, and Lauren rested her head against the seat, with her hand still holding his, and she whispered that a mother was truly frightening, and Dominic laughed without restraint this time, and said he had warned her, and that his mother liked her, and that she had been approved, and she asked what that meant, and he said it meant she would now be summoned to family weddings and little nephews' birthdays, and of course the weekly Sunday dinner, and Lauren laughed and leaned into his shoulder and said it sounded like family, and Dominic tightened his fingers around hers and kept his eyes on the road with a warmth that filled the car, and said she was family, and amid a city that never slept as the car slipped through streets already lit, Lauren knew she was no longer a person standing at the edge of Dominic's life, that she had stepped inside, and that the door had closed behind her, not to lock her in, but to keep her close. 3 days after Sunday dinner at Rosa's house, the warmth and chaos of Dominic's family still echoed in Lauren's mind, the laughter, the wine, the way his eyes sought her, across a crowded room, and that evening Dominic took her to a small restaurant tucked into a lane in Little Italy, where soft golden light pooled, and a violin sang from a corner, and he said little along the way and simply held her hand as if that alone could fill every quiet space, and when they entered, she felt the place was particular, and did not need him to say so, because she could read it in the respectful nods from the staff, and in the small window table already waiting, with white flowers and 2 glasses of wine, and they sat and ordered, and let the music and light settle the faint tremor between them, and Lauren studied him and found a contemplative cast not often present, and asked if he had brought her here for a reason, and Dominic nodded, and poured wine, and did not speak at once, as if testing each word for weight, and then leaned forward and let his gaze rest on her face, and said he knew he was not easy, and that he was controlling, stubborn, and somewhat fierce, and that from a moment she stepped into his life, everything had shifted, not with noise or sudden force, but in small, steady turns, and that she had not broken him, but had made him softer, and Lauren smiled in a voice rasped by wine, and asked if he was confessing that she had made him weak, and Dominic shook his head, and took her hand, and said no, and that she made him stronger in a way power never could, and that he was stronger because he wanted to protect her, and to build with her, and to become better for her, and that he loved her, and the words hung in the still air like a single sustained note. No one dared to interrupt, and Lauren stilled, and her heart skipped, then rushed so fast she could almost hear it, and Dominic did not look away or pull the words back, and he sat there certain as a living vow, and Lauren did not answer at once, and instead slipped her hand free and rose and went around the table and settled in his lap as if any distance between them now was needless, and she set her palm to his cheek, and whispered with a near trembling steadiness that she had loved him from the first night upstairs, when he held her there and said it was his fault, and that he would make it right, and that she had loved the way he put her safety above all. And the way he looked at her as if she were not only a dancer or a student, but the only person in the room. And Dominic's hand closed lightly at her waist, and he said nothing, and she went on more firmly and told him she loved him, and that, whatever darkness he carried, she would not run, and that she knew who he was, and that she chose him, and he did not answer in words, and drew her close and kissed her as if pouring everything unspoken into the brush of mouth and breath. The kiss was deep and unhurried, and not an act of possession but a shelter built between them, and when they parted he rested his forehead to hers, and murmured that there was no road back now, and that he would not let her go, and she breathed against his lips that she had no intention of leaving, and they left the restaurant hand in hand as if the world had narrowed to two. And Lauren understood that once those 3 simple words were spoken, everything had changed, and what had been silent, looks and quiet acts, had become a love named and recognized and held with everything they were, and in 2 lives marked by fractures. They had found each other not as a temporary brace but as a place to begin something lasting. Lauren did not notice the unease at once, but something began to trouble her, and a black car idled near her, building 3 times in 1 week, and a stranger sat in the familiar cafe across from the university and watched whenever she walked in, and there were figures without clear faces and eyes that did not look away, no matter how calm she pretended to be, and at first she thought it might be nerves left over from what had happened with Richard Claymore. Yet, when the car appeared on the very street where she and Dominic liked to walk on weekends, her heart tightened as if a cord had pulled taut, and that night back in the high-floor apartment above the Crimson Room, she told Dominic because she would not hide it even if she feared worrying him, and he went very still as he listened. His face did not change, yet in his eyes something shifted deep and cold, and he asked if she was sure it was not chance, and she said no, that at first it had seemed so, but now it did not, and that they did not approach or speak, but she felt to it clearly that she was being watched. Dominic rose at once without another word, and took out his phone and spoke a few clipped sentences in Italian, and she only caught the name Marco, and when he ended the call he took her hand with a pressure calm and chilling and told her that from now on she would not go anywhere alone, not to class and not to the corner store, and that Marco would put a team on her, and that, as for whoever was following her, he would find out, and he would handle it, and Lauren wanted to ask what handle meant, yet she did not need to because she knew him, and knew the darker part he kept away from daylight until pressed, and this time someone had pressed. That night Dominic did not leave her side and lay beside her with his eyes never fully closed, and one hand always on her, as if to be certain she remained safe within reach. And in the morning, Marco waited at the door with 2 other men in dark suits with discreet earpieces, and they stayed with her all day at a respectful distance, missing nothing, and Dominic spoke little for 2 days and kept to his phone, and the calls in Italian were long and low and edged, and on the 3rd, a night he came home with shadows under his eyes and his shirt marked by dried blood, and Lauren opened the door as he reached it, and before she could speak, he pulled her into his arms and held hard, and said it was done, and that they would not trouble her again, and she asked who they were, with her hand flat to his chest, feeling a steady and heavy beat, and Dominic was quiet for a long breath, and said they were Richard Claymore's people, a small knot who remained loyal and imagined they could frighten her and force him to pull back what he had shared with the prosecutor, and she asked what he had done, and he said he had given them a choice to disappear, or to disappear forever, and his voice did not shake and did not rise, and simply carried the even weight of business, and Lauren knew in those words was a world she had only touched at the edge, and she stepped back and looked at him for a long time, and saw bruises on his hand and a scrape at his wrist and blood on his collar, and Dominic did not hide and stood still for her to see without excuse or plea, only waiting, and she asked if he was hurt, and he shook his head and said nothing worth mention, and she asked if anyone had died, and he did not answer, and that silence was an answer, and Lauren moved into him and held him and asked no more, and did not accuse, and simply held on, and in that embrace lay acceptance, and the knowledge that love sometimes travels with what is not clean, and that the man before her was light and shadow both, and that he was hers, and had chosen to protect her with everything he had, and she whispered that she was afraid, but that she understood, and that she would not run, and Dominic let his head fall to her shoulder, as if finally allowed to exhale, and said he would do whatever it took to keep her safe, even if it meant becoming the man he had once tried to leave behind because she was his, and he would not let anyone harm her again. Dominic said little after that night, and told her it was over, yet Lauren could feel something wrong at the edges, and he appeared as always, and held her each night, and made breakfast as usual, yet fatigue showed in small ways, and then he stopped in the middle of speaking with a blink as if steadying himself, and sometimes he came from the shower with his left shoulder tight as if bracing against a pain without a name, and one afternoon when Lauren came back from a shift in the office, she found Marco waiting at the door with worry he could not hide, and he had never come like that and never with that look, and she asked where Dominic was with her heart pounding. And Marco said quietly that Dominic had been hurt, and that a faction among Claymore's men had refused the terms and had set an ambush, and that Dominic had ended it, but had been shot, and Lauren felt the floor tilt under her, and she asked, where and when, and he said the previous night at the southern docks, and that they had brought him home at once, and that it was not life-threatening, and that the bullet had grazed his left side, and that Dominic's private doctor had treated it, and that he was resting in the apartment. And Lauren did not wait for more and ran upstairs with her heart hammering as if to break its cage. And when she opened the door, she saw Dominic on the sofa, with his shirt open and a wide bandage. At his left rib stained a little with fresh pink, and he turned at her step with eyes still keen and lined by fatigue, and said he was fine at once, as if he knew what she would ask. And Lauren said nothing, and went to him, and sat on the floor, and took his hand with the care one. Give something that hurts, and asked why he had not told her, and Dominic sighed and said, because he knew she would panic, and because he had not wanted her to see him like this weak and bloodied, and the version of himself he tried to keep her from, and she told him not to be foolish, with a voice shaking with anger and fear, and said he could not hide everything to protect her, and asked if he thought she would love a wall, and told him she loved him with the wounds and the weariness, and the part he did not show anyone. And Dominic studied her a long while, and stroked her cheek, and said she was always stronger than he imagined, and that she always knew how to make him feel he could soften, and she laid her head to his chest, and listened to the slow, steady beat, and asked if it hurt, and he said it did, and gave a small laugh, and that with her there it hurt less, and she did not leave him that evening and changed his bandage with trembling fingers, and wiped away the dried blood and set fresh antiseptic and wrapped each layer with care, and Dominic winced and did not make a sound, and only gripped her hand when the pain surged, and she said that Marco claimed the remaining group had been handled, and asked if it was truly over. Dominic said it was, and that they had understood and that no one would dare touch her again, and she asked about him, and how many more times he meant to run into the fire for her, and he said as many as it took, as long as she was safe, and that he did not care what he had to sacrifice, and that she was his home, and that he would not let anyone take her, and his words were not a sentimental confession, but a cold oath spoken by a man who had lived at the edge of life and death. And Lauren did not answer and kissed his forehead like a promise, and told him that next time he must let her go at his side and not walk into it alone. And Dominic nodded and closed his hand hard around hers, and in that instant they were no longer a hurt girl and a dangerous man, and were two people learning to love with every wound they had carried. 1 week after Dominic was injured, Lauren returned to her final class of the term. She had asked for 2 absences to stay by his side to care for him and to make sure he did not try to hide the pain as he always did. Dominic might be a powerful man accustomed to control, but Lauren understood that when he was hurt he needed her there in silence without judgment, simply present. As Lauren quietly stacked her course materials and carefully marked the last notes to prepare for graduation, Dominic appeared behind her, with his arm still bandaged, and a glint of pride in his eyes that he usually tried to conceal, and he said in his warm, low voice that she was about to be a graduate and that he knew it had not been easy to study and to work and to be involved with a man like him. And Lauren turned and smiled and told him he was not just any man, and that he was Dominic Russo, who had given her a job and a home and a place to stand, and also his heart. And Dominic came closer and held her with his uninjured arm, gently, yet with unmistakable strength. And he said he wanted to go with her on graduation day, and that he would sit there for 3 hours and listen to long speeches just to see her walk across the stage. And she told him he hated crowds, and he said he also hated coffee without sugar, but she made him drink it every morning, so this was fair. And Lauren laughed and nodded and said he had to wear a suit and could not show up in leather like a Mafia figure at her school. And he said he would wear whatever she chose, as long as she agreed to let him grin when she wore that peculiar square cap. On the morning of the ceremony, Lauren stood before the mirror for a long time, the black gown draped over her body, and beneath it, a simple white dress she had kept from her first interview at the Crimson Room, and everything felt like a circle closing, and she was no longer the Lauren who walked into a shabby apartment in Queens, a poor student who studied and danced, and she was a grown woman self-possessed who had come through a storm and still stood. Dominic arrived in a black luxury car, and he wore a gray suit and a black tie with no blood and no bruises, and he was simply Dominic, clean, handsome, and quietly proud. Throughout the ceremony, he sat a few rows back, and never let his eyes leave the stage. And when the name Lauren Sullivan rang out, Dominic was the first to rise, and he clapped so hard that those around him began to laugh with him, and Lauren turned and found his gaze, and in that instant, she felt she had won the greatest battle of her life. After the ceremony, they left the campus, and Dominic drove in silence to a small restaurant in Little Italy, and when they stepped into the pra, a warm room with candlelight flickering and a hint of basil in the air, Lauren asked why here, and Dominic admitted that this was the place where he had first planned to ask her to dinner, but had not dared because then she had felt far away. And he had been only a terse nightclub owner in a world full of shadows, and she asked, "What about now?" And he poured wine into her glass and said that now she was the woman he was most proud of, living proof that good things can rise from places that seem made only of ruin. And Lauren touched her glass to his with eyes bright from feeling and said she had not done it alone, and that without him, and without the Crimson Room, and without the man who stood up for justice when her arm was broken, she would not have this day. And Dominic lifted a hand to her cheek and said she had always had it, and that he had only reminded her she deserved it all. That dinner had no extravagance, no costly champagne and no diamond ring, and there were only 2 people and 2 glasses of wine and a long road of tears and pride behind them. And for Lauren, it was the sweetest evening she had ever known, because for the first time in her life, she felt not only that she had completed a goal, but that someone truly saw her and was proud of who she had become. 1 week after the graduation, Lauren returned to the Crimson Room as usual, but now with a completely different bearing, and she was no longer a student working her way along, and no longer the girl with a broken arm from a night best. Forgotten, and she entered the office like a woman who knew where she stood and what she wanted. And Dominic was already there, studying the books with his focused look, and when he saw her, he gave a small smile that belonged only to her. Lauren set a cup of coffee on the desk, and leaned against the chair across from him, and said she had brought coffee for the boss. And Dominic lifted his eyes with a glint of mischief, and said he would drink if she sat down because he knew I longer wanted to be. Just the boss and the words made Lauren pause for a beat, and she sat and laid her hand on the desk, and watched him and Dominic set the books aside, and opened a drawer, and took out a slim folder, and placed it before her, and said in a slow, low tone that this was a contract transferring part ownership of the Crimson Room, and that half was hers, and that she was not only the best manager he had ever had, but the only person who made the place better each day. And Lauren said she did not understand as she turned the pages, without truly seeing the words, and Dominic leaned forward and set his hand over hers, and said she had changed how the place ran, and made the women feel safe and heard and respected, and had created an environment he had only dared to dream of, and that she had also done what he had failed to do for years, by bringing trust and sincerity into a place that had been ruled by power and fear. And Lauren asked softly if he was doing this because she was his girlfriend, and Dominic shook his head and said no, and that he was doing this because she deserved it, as a woman, a manager, and a partner, and that he loved her, which was true, yet had nothing to do with the decision, and that she had built a new part of the soul of the Crimson Room, and that she was no longer an employee but a pillar, and that he wanted to share everything with her, not only feeling but responsibility. And Lauren lifted the pen with a faint tremor, then set it down and studied him for a long moment and said this was not a gift, was it, and that it was an invitation. And Dominic nodded and said yes, an invitation to join together, not only to run the place but to decide its future, and that they would expand, perhaps add another location, and that it was her idea, and if she wanted she would lead it. And Lauren leaned back and her eyes went distant for a breath, as she remembered the first days when she came here in cheap heels with a stage light on red lipstick and a fada false name on the billing, and she remembered the night she fell under the hand of a man who did not respect rules, and the only person who stood to defend her was the man before her, and now he was handing her the power not only to stand firm but to rise, and she took the pen, and signed her name with a decisive hand, and said she accepted, and Dominic said nothing and rose and came behind her chair and set a kiss on the crown of her head, gentle and full of pride, and whispered that she would not regret it, and Lauren looked up with shining eyes and said she had never regretted anything since meeting him, and that if she had to move forward with someone in this world, she wanted that someone to be him. And Dominic squeezed her shoulder and walked to the window to look out at the city, lighting itself, and from that day the Crimson Room was not only the place where they had met, but the place where they would write a new chapter together, not as owner and employee, but as two equals, building something larger than themselves, and in the dimming light over Manhattan, the two of them, a man with a warm heart shaped by the underworld and a woman who had stood up after harm, became partners not only in business but in the journey of their lives. 1 week after becoming a co-owner of the Crimson Room, Lauren thought her life had reached a fullness she had never dared to dream of, and each day she woke in Dominic's arms and ran a place with him that had once been a symbol of wounds, and was now a sign of restoration and beginning. And Dominic remained Dominic, mysterious and quiet, sometimes distant with work, yet always placing her at the center of what he did. And on a late evening he invited her to a small Italian restaurant in a stone-paved alley in Queens, the place where he had first taken her for a serious dinner, when neither of them knew how far they would go. And Lauren entered in a red dress, and searched for him among candlelight, and gently playing classical music, and the restaurant was closed for them alone, and only soft light, and the aroma of tomato sauce drifted through, and Dominic stood waiting at the corner table, where months earlier they had spoken of new beginnings, and he drew out her chair and said little, and only held her hand and smiled, and they ate slowly, as if there were no need to hurry, and as if he were waiting for something, and Lauren sensed a subtle strangeness in the air, like a heartbeat stretched, and a silence with a purpose. And when dessert was set down, Dominic did not touch it, and instead stood and came around to her and went down on one knee, and Lauren froze, and her heart stopped for a beat, and then rushed back so fast it left her dizzy, and Dominic drew a black velvet box from his jacket, and the light caught a simple, elegant diamond set in a bright platinum ring, and he lifted his gaze to her, the dark brown eyes sincere and deeper than anything she had ever seen, and he said, "Lauren Sullivan, you entered my life on a night of chaos with a wound, and with pride in your eyes, and from that, the moment I was no longer the same man, and you not only made me want to be better, but made me believe in something I once thought, a luxury which is love, and I love you with everything I have, and I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you and building a future with you, and loving you in a way no one ever has, and will you marry me?" And Lauren had believed she would cry in that moment, yet no tears fell, and there was only a peace spreading through her, as if every choice and every bend in the road had led here, and she nodded without a shred of doubt, and smiled wide enough that Dominic exhaled in relief, and she said she would marry him forever, and Dominic slid the ring onto her finger and rose and drew her into his arms, and they held each other for a long time, without another word, because the most important things had been spoken, and there were no more secrets, and no more fear, and there was only love, and a promise, and a permanent beginning. And that night they returned to the apartment, above the Crimson Room, which had once been her refuge after pain and was now their home, and Dominic no longer needed to shield her from the world, because now they shielded one another together, and when he kissed her forehead before they fell asleep, he whispered in that beloved low voice that she was everything, and she answered gently and surely that she was his forever. On a warm, clear autumn morning in a small church tucked inside an old Queens neighborhood, where Dominic's family had rooted itself for generations, Lauren and Dominic were married. The chapel dressed with simple olive branches and white flowers that carried a quiet peace, a promise that two people who had weathered their storms had finally found one another. Dominic, in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, stood at the altar with his gaze fixed on the door where Lauren would appear, and when the piano began she came forward in a white gown, her face luminous and her eyes bright with feeling. She moved slowly along an aisle scattered with white petals as morning light poured through the windows and turned the moment dreamlike, and there was no one in the pews who could deny how plainly and truthfully love stood in the room. Beneath the soft veil of makeup was a woman who had known harm and fracture, yet now stood steady beside a man who had not only guarded her, but helped her find herself again. Hand in hand, they spoke their vows before family and friends, and those who had seen them at their lowest and in their rising. And when the minister asked whether they would walk through life together, the answer was a sure nod without a breath of doubt. The kiss that sealed their marriage was not loud or showy, only a gentle meeting of mouths holding the long journey they had taken from their darkest nights to the light of this day. The reception followed in the churchyard, where long tables overflowed with traditional Italian dishes prepared by Dominic's family, laughter and clinking glasses and music, braided together like a hymn to life and happiness. Lauren danced with Dominic's mother, a strong woman who had once looked her straight in the eye in the family kitchen and asked whether she was strong enough to love a man like Dominic. And now the mother folded her into an embrace and whispered that she was the right woman this family had been waiting for. Near day's end, when the light turned everything to gold, Lauren and Dominic slipped away hand in hand and went back to the place that had once been Lauren's refuge and was now their home. On the rooftop above the Crimson Room, they sat together and watched the city kindle its lamps. Dominic kissed her hair and murmured as if saying something sacred he would never stop repeating that she was his. And Lauren smiled and rested her head on his shoulder and answered softly that he was hers forever. Their story reminds us of something essential, that sometimes from pain that seems beyond bearing, from a break and a wound, the greatest love of a life can begin. That in a restless world, there are those willing to step into your life, not to control or to rescue, but to walk beside you, to love you, to protect you, and most of all to remind you that you are worthy of being loved completely. Thank you for staying with this tender journey to its end. If this path touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and like and share, so that together we can carry more stories that move the spirit each day. How does the love between Lauren and Dominic speak to your own life, and what does it call up in you? Leave us a note below so we can listen to what rises from the deepest part of your heart. That is what helps us continue making videos that reach the soul and stir feeling. Until next time, when we will return with more stories of love, hope, and renewal. May you have health, joy, and peace each day. Farewell, and see you soon.